Parents, what spooky past life memory did your kid utter? Story 1. When my daughter was 3 and just starting to speak more clearly, she was talking to someone. Concerned, I walked into the bedroom, but no one was there. At first, I assumed she was just playing with her toys. A few days later, the same thing happened. But this time I asked who she was talking to, and she replied, "Your grandma." I thought she meant my mom, who had recently passed away, so I showed her a picture and asked, "Is this her?" She replied, "No, your grandma." I found a picture of my grandmother, and with a big smile she said, "Yes, her." I was completely shocked because I don't have any pictures of my grandmother displayed, and she passed away in 1991. My daughter was born in 2015. Story 2. Not a parent, but I remember telling my mom when I was about 3 years old about my royal family. I still have this vivid and cryptic memory of standing in a desert with a dark, shallow pool. The sun was setting, and my younger brother reached down and splashed the water in the pool, which made everyone very upset. There was something sacred about that pool. It has always stayed with me. When I was 16, I met someone, and we became friends. At 18, we talked about reincarnation, and he told me the exact same story, but from the brother's perspective. I had never told him about my memory. It still creeps me out to this day. Story 3. I was the child in this story. I don't remember any of it, but when I was 4, we traveled to Ireland to visit my dad's grandparents. We were walking through a shopping area when I suddenly started yelling about wanting to see the train and ran into a store. My parents followed quickly as I was acting completely frantic about this train. But there was no train. It was a clothing store. The woman working there asked my parents what was going on, as I was just running around in a panic. Finally, I shouted, "The train!" In the back of the store, I had found a framed newspaper clipping from the 1940s, showing the front window of that same shop back when it had been a toy store. It featured a large model train display. Story 4. Not a parent, but apparently I look like the male version of my mom's grandmother. What's even creepier is that apparently I act just like her, talk like her, and think just like her. She died 10 years before I was born, I think. Maybe even longer ago. And she lived far, far away. The strange part is that none of this feedback comes from family members. It comes from random elderly people who knew her. The creepiest example happened when I was a teenager. We went to Disney in Florida, and I was chatting with an older couple who were there with their grandkids. After a while, the woman said I looked and acted just like her childhood neighbor. Without thinking, and for no reason whatsoever, I blurted out, "Soy yo, Marisol." At that point, the woman had never mentioned the name Marisol, and I had no idea she spoke Spanish, nor did she know I spoke Spanish. She responded completely serious, "Dora, last name? De calle, Javier in Buenos Aires." I suddenly snapped back to myself and stammered that I was her great-grandson. Meanwhile, my mom had chills and started tearing up. I've also had several people with dementia who once knew her call me by her name and try to start a remember when conversation. Some of the memories they brought up gave me a strong sense of déjà vu. At my grandfather's funeral, this happened dozens of times with people I had never met. One day, I hope to go back to her hometown if that ever becomes possible. She grew up near what was then Grodno, Poland, now Hrodna, Belarus, before moving to Buenos Aires during the Holocaust. I know that traveling to Belarus isn't easy or common, but I wonder if I'd feel strange past life energy if I ever made it there. Story 5. Not a mom, but I was a nanny for many years. One of my little ones, a 2-year-old and incredibly smart child, was way ahead developmentally in almost every way. He used to like telling me things while we got him ready for bed. They were almost always these weird stories that started with, "When I was an old lady," and they were always very specific little day in the life of things, which I quickly realized went beyond the experience and vocabulary of a typical 2-year-old. Over a few months, he kept adding to the story, always very consistently. Sometimes he would pretend to be the old lady, with a cloth over his head, walking slowly like he had back pain. His favorite playtime was grocery shopping or using his sister's dolls as if they were his grandchildren. He gave specific details like how many children she had, 4 daughters and a son, and how many grandchildren. Her husband had died in his 50s, the same age as one of his uncles, from a lung disease. One of her daughters had died in her 30s in a car accident, leaving behind 2 children that she took in with the help of another daughter. She had a bad back and pain in her feet. One of her daughters would rub her feet to help ease the pain. All but one of her children were married. The unmarried daughter lived with her, and she worried she'd never marry. She remembered dying. She said she was crossing the street when a car hit her. She described how people gathered around, where it hurt, and how someone eventually lifted her into a car. There were no ambulances, and took her to the hospital where she passed away. I wasn't his only nanny, and he was consistent with these stories. Us nannies would get together and share stories, and I used to write them down because I was already fascinated with things like past lives and wanted to see how it all developed. He also described the house and neighborhood she lived in. This was especially striking because the child came from a very wealthy family and had never seen the type of poverty or housing he talked about. He also mentioned living by the seaside. Months later, we visited a seaside city on the other side of the country. One day, while heading to a relative's birthday party, our driver got lost. This was before Google Maps and smartphones. We ended up driving through a very poor neighborhood, and suddenly the little boy started yelling and insisted we turn down some specific streets. He pointed out the window, telling us things he recognized from when I was an old lady. It matched what he had previously described, and we were all curious. So we let him guide us since we were already running late. He accurately predicted what we'd see around the next corner several times. But he became very confused and upset when we got to where her house was, because it was now a store. The driver leaned out and asked an elderly person nearby what used to be there. And they said, houses. We never returned or got any further confirmation. His parents were understandably concerned by the vividness of his stories. So after that incident, we made a conscious effort to redirect him to different types of play. As he approached age 3, he started telling these stories less and less. By around 3:30, he didn't even remember ever talking about being an old lady. He thought we were just making it up. To this day, more than 25 years later, I still can't explain it. Edit. I remembered more details while replying to someone in the comments and wanted to add them here. I wish I still had the notebook I used to write everything in. It's been so long that I only remember the big moments. I should mention that this didn't happen in a Western country, and he was a very protected, privileged child. He didn't even meet another child outside of his family until he was 3, when he started a very exclusive kindergarten, after I begged his parents for months. He rarely watched TV, and when he did, it was heavily filtered. Mostly Barney, not even Disney. So he wasn't exposed to much media that could have influenced these stories. We, the nannies, never talked about the things he described, and none of us were from that country either. The specific cultural details he gave left us baffled. For example, once while playing, he put a cloth over his head and danced in an oddly specific way. His aunt saw him and burst out laughing. She said he was dancing like an old woman at a wedding. It was a traditional dance performed by mothers and grandmothers. There were other strange little validations too. Also, we were told specifically not to encourage that kind of play. In that culture, anything considered non-conforming behavior wasn't well received, and there was concern that it might mean he wasn't normal. Personally, I don't believe in a fixed version of normal. Everyone is valid as they are. So we never led him on or encouraged those stories. In fact, we tried to steer him away from it. Story 6. Not the parent. This time, I was the kid. Apparently, when I was about 4, I had frequent nightmares. They always started the same way. I would scream the name Sarah, then loudly call for help, waking up everyone in the house, and finally I would start sobbing, repeating, I'm so sorry, over and over while crying. In the morning, I never remembered any of it. My parents had no idea what caused it. They didn't know anyone named Sarah. I hadn't started preschool. We didn't have a TV or any media in the house, and I only knew a few basic words. Nothing they tried seemed to stop the episodes. This went on for almost a year until one day, it just stopped. My mom tried asking me about it once, and I apparently told her something like, Sarah doesn't want to see me crying anymore, so I won't. I didn't find out about any of this until years later, during a conversation with my parents. We were talking about names we liked, and I mentioned that I'd always thought the name Sarah was beautiful. Story 7. Not me, but my friend's little sister. The whole family was out for dinner at a restaurant in a ski village where they had recently bought a cottage nearby. As soon as they walked in, my friend's little sister said, I know this place. My mother and I used to paint here. Her mother replied, We've never been here before. What do you mean? The girl said, No. My mother, from before. We used to paint here all the time. The family was understandably a little freaked out but didn't think too much of it, assuming she was just playing around since she was still quite young. Later on, while talking to the waitress, the little girl again firmly insisted that she used to paint there. The waitress then revealed that the place had actually been an art studio for many years in the 1900s, before being converted into a restaurant in the early 2000s. Needless to say, the entire table, including the waitress, got goosebumps and was at a complete loss for words. Story 8. When he was 3, my husband decided to treat our son to a flight over our city in a Cessna. When it was time to board the plane, our boy climbed into the pilot's seat and became extremely upset when told he had to move. He started crying and saying he was sorry, that he didn't mean to crash the plane last time, and that he'd be good this time. My husband calmed him down by pointing out that his legs were too short to reach the pedals. Once he settled into the back seat, he started fussing about not being able to use the radio, so the pilot gave him a headset but didn't plug it in fully. Our son then began trying to raise the tower for a radio check and clearance. At that point, the pilot said he needed a quick break and went for a smoke. While he was gone, my husband talked to our son, who said that he had crashed the last plane he flew and that a lot of people had died. When the pilot returned, they were able to complete the flight without further issues. About a year later, we visited an aeronautics museum where an old Mosquito was being restored. Our son told the curator that he used to fly one of those, so the man offered us a tour. Inside, our son pointed out several things that were wrong with the plane, and he was right. Things like the joystick being the wrong type. The curator explained that the plane had been modernized and was now being restored to its original condition, confirming that the components our son had noticed were indeed going to be replaced. Our child is grown now and doesn't remember ever being a pilot. He has no interest in planes anymore, but he does remember just knowing things about airplanes and how to fly them. Story 9. My daughter talks about her grandson all the time. I assumed it was just an imaginary friend, but a few nights ago she came out of her room at bedtime absolutely sobbing and said, "I'm sad because I miss my grandson. He lives in my old house, in my old neighborhood." She has never lived anywhere other than this apartment. Edit. Totally thought this would get buried. To answer some questions, we've asked her about him, but it's hit or miss whether she'll respond seriously or just act like it's a game. The other night, after some questions, she told us that he sleeps in a crib and has a white tongue. But when I asked her his name a few hours ago, she said Guga and laughed and laughed. It could absolutely be her imagination, but she also said some strange things about the baby I lost a few months ago, which really makes me wonder if she remembers or knows things that we don't. Story 10. My younger sister, when she was 3, started talking to my mom about, "When I was a big girl, and you were a little girl." She said she went to our parents' wedding. She described her former self physically, and my mom said that she sounded exactly like my mom's grandmother, Grace. My sister also talked about the greenhouse she used to live in at the end of a dirt road, and how her mother, my mom's great-grandmother, Matilda, died from a snake bite while they lived there. She described the snake as pretty, and based on her description, my mom believes she was describing a copperhead. Now we lived in northern Nebraska, where there are no copperheads, and Matilda had died in southeast Oklahoma, which is copperhead territory. My sister said she killed the snake with a hoe. These stories were always shared at bedtime. One day we were outside working in the garden, and my dad was sitting down sharpening a hoe with a file. My sister told him he was doing it wrong. He asked her to show him how, and she placed her hands over his to position them correctly. Later, he admitted she was right. He had been doing it wrong. For those curious about the timeline, this happened in 1980. My mother's grandmother, Grace, died in 1968, and her great-grandmother, Matilda, died in 1902. Also, we don't have confirmation that Matilda died from a snake bite. It's just what my sister claimed. I was 15 at the time, so I remember these nightly stories pretty well. She probably shared these things on and off for about 6 months, and by age 4 she'd say, "I'm tired of talking about it." I'm not a great writer, so I hope this wasn't too confusing. Story 11. When my brother was about 3 back in the 90s, our family was sitting down for dinner when he randomly said, "Dad, remember when I lived in Spain?" We're from the UK. My dad, just going along with it, said, "Yeah?" And my brother continued, saying he used to live in Spain with his other family, but he died during a fishing trip with his dad. He said the last thing he remembered was his dad's hand trying to reach him as he drowned. He even listed some Spanish names for his parents. names that there was no way he would have known at that age. He also began meditating in his room from time to time. Eventually, he stopped talking about it as he got a little older and doesn't remember anything about it now. It's wild to hear how many people have experienced similar things. Story 12. I only have two vivid memories from my preschool years. I remember thinking about specific people who weren't there at the time, but I've no idea who they were in my memories. It feels like there's so much more to those moments that's just out of reach. The first memory would have been when I was just learning to talk, so around 18 to 24 months old. I was standing on our gravel driveway on a hot day with my mom. I asked her for some wah-wah, and she told me to say water. I asked again for wah-wah, and she replied, "If you want a drink, you must say water." I distinctly remember thinking, you know what I want? Why are you doing this? They said this one was going to be easy. The next memory happened a year or two later. My older sister excitedly told me, "Now you get to learn to read." And again, I clearly remember thinking, no, they promised this time would be easy. This isn't easy. What is all this? I still remember the feeling of disappointment in both moments. I love learning now, but I'm sure that when I die, I'll be having a serious conversation with someone about the definition of easy. Story 13. When I was 4, there was something on TV about the Royal Air Force showing Lancaster bombers in a commemorative segment. I think it was a news report marking an old raid or something. Apparently, I looked up from playing with my toys and said very clearly something along the lines of, "I really miss Ron from Scampton." I'm not sure that's exactly how I said it. My parents asked what I meant, and I said something like, "He died in Germany." Naturally, they brushed it off, assuming I was just playing around. But there were a few details that made this very unsettling. I was 4 years old and living in Aberdeen, Scotland. There was no way I could have known about Scampton, Lincolnshire, or that it was an RAF base that had Lancaster bombers during World War II. No one in my family knew anyone named Ron, and there wasn't a Ron in my school class either. So where did I even get that name from? And how did it end up in that very specific sentence? At 4, I had very little knowledge of World War II. I probably knew it involved Germany and some other countries, but nothing more than that. The really chilling part came later. When I was 10, my family moved to Nottingham after my parents divorced. That just happened to be about a 40-minute drive from RAF Scampton. While in Nottingham, I joined the Air Cadets, which is kind of like the American JROTC, a youth program to introduce kids to military life. One of our field trips was a visit to RAF Scampton to explore its history. Part of the tour involved visiting the cemetery to pay respects at the war graves. While we were there, I was stunned to see a grave for a man named Ron Evans, who died in a Lancaster bomber raid over Germany in 1945. It hit me so hard that my whole body got chills and the hair on my arms stood on end. It felt like something inside me had just been triggered. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. I really don't know, but I thought it was a story worth sharing. Story 14. Not a parent, but when I was young, I used to have a recurring dream where I was a Roman archer, trying to fend off an attack from what looked like the Mongols. I would describe the armor and weapons to my parents, even though I hadn't seen them before. At the time, I didn't know it was Roman armor or Mongolian clothing and weapons. But once I eventually saw those styles in books or media, I thought, oh yeah, that's the armor from my dreams. I remember clearly that I was standing in a small line of archers next to a fort with a tree right beside it. The invaders came out of a thick forest on horseback. There was a slight slope going downhill from the tree to my left. The attackers wore furs and carried curved swords. They easily broke through the foot soldiers, and most of our arrows missed. I remember being struck by the sword of the man in the front, on the left side of my head. Coincidentally, I have a single gray hair that always grows in that exact spot. Whenever my hair grows out, that one gray hair always shows. I've even tried searching for that fort through image searches and found only a couple that look somewhat familiar. I don't have the dream anymore, but I still remember everything in vivid detail. Story 15. Not sure if it counts as a past life memory. It's more like channeling someone. My son was playing a game at the kitchen table with my mother when he was about 3 or 4 years old. He's usually very animated, but suddenly he got really quiet and just stared at his grandmother for a full minute. She seemed shocked by what she saw in his eyes. Then he said, "You're doing okay," and gave her a gentle smile. After that, he immediately went back to being his usual goofy self. She got up, crying, and left the table to go to her bedroom. Later, she said that when he looked at her like that, his face and smile looked exactly like her father's, and his voice even sounded just like her dad's voice, just for those few words. Her father had passed away a few years earlier, and he had always worried about her and her future. She said she never saw that resemblance in my son again. Story 16. My daughter once asked me, "Remember my fancy hat?" When I said no, she replied, "Yeah, before I was dead. I used to work in a bank. I saved my money and bought a hat in a round box. I was on the bus, and a man almost sat on it. Then the bus crashed and I died." She was about 3 years old and said it totally casually. Editing for clarity. My daughter definitely knew about hat boxes. She was really into musicals, and one of her favorites was Easter Parade, a movie where fancy hats are a big theme. She also went through a phase of being fascinated by death after my mom passed away, so I think that's where the bus crash story might have come from. At the time, we talked a lot about death, dying, and how sudden accidents can happen. Personally, I think kids say weird things sometimes because their brains aren't fully wired yet. Apparently, when I was her age, I used to talk to a teddy bear that lived in a cabinet and would sit happily chatting at an open door for ages. Story 17. I'm the child in this story. Let me start by saying that I consider myself a rational person. I lean heavily towards science and logic over faith or anything supernatural. That said, I have no explanation for what I experienced. I'll do my best to summarize it. I was 4 or younger. My brother, who's 4 years younger than me, hadn't been born yet, and I was spending the night at my grandparents' house. They were staying up late to watch the Olympics, but the upside for me was that I got to sleep in their bed. Normally, I would sleep in my dad's old bedroom. I was having trouble falling asleep, which was normal. I never slept well, but the soft glow from the TV in the other room was calming. Suddenly, I felt cold. I didn't feel scared, but my body started shivering. A new light appeared in the room, this one to my right. Nervous, I slowly turned my head. At the side of the bed was an older woman. She was translucent, with a faint blue tint. She didn't look scary, but her presence was unsettling. She was sitting in the rocking chair, holding a small dog and looking directly at me. I instantly ducked under the blankets. I was scared and turned to the other side of the bed, eyes tightly shut. I stayed that way for what felt like forever. Still under the covers, I eventually opened my eyes. A new color appeared. This time, a warm orange light replaced the blue one. Like a fool, I peeked out from under the blankets. On the other side of the bed, there were men on fire. They weren't moving or screaming, just standing there, burning. I turned around and the woman was now standing. Her mouth didn't move, but I heard a voice in my head say, "They aren't there. They can't hurt anymore." After that, I don't remember anything else. The next morning, I refused to get out of bed until my parents arrived. After some coaxing, I finally told them about the nightmare. They laughed, thinking it was just a wild story from a child's imagination. My dad casually shared it with his parents. That's when things took a turn. My grandfather, a very stoic, reserved man, nearly passed out. He began crying and couldn't speak at first. When he finally calmed down, he told my dad that after returning from Vietnam, he would lie awake having panic attacks. His mother would stand over him while he relived his time as a flamethrower operator. While he slept, she'd sit in that same rocking chair and watch over him to make sure he rested. To this day, I have no explanation. I don't know why I saw his memories. I've never had any other supernatural experience like it, but that one moment has stayed burned into my mind forever. Story 18. Not my child, but a very close friend's daughter. When she was born, my friend and his wife lived in a house from the Civil War era. It was a very old but stunningly beautiful place. Strange things happened there. For example, a peacock used to roam around the property, but the moment they brought their daughter home from the hospital, the peacock disappeared and was never seen again. I visited once, and I remember the wife going down to the basement to grab some canned food. Moments later, she came running up the stairs, screaming in total panic. She said that when she turned around with the cans in her hands, she saw a figure in a large-brimmed hat standing silently in the far corner of the room. Their daughter's bedroom was always freezing, not just cold, but the kind of cold that makes your stomach turn. As she grew older, she was often seen on the baby monitor, sitting quietly in the corner of her crib, speaking in gibberish to something off camera. Eventually, the family moved due to work opportunities. 8 full years after moving out, their daughter was sitting at the dinner table looking sad. When asked why, she quietly said, I missed my friend from my old bedroom. My friend and his wife were completely spooked. Story 19. My mom swears that when I was a kid, I once told her, Grandpa says he was really sorry. He didn't mean to hurt the family. I was about 8 years old. I have no memory of ever saying this. I never had the chance to meet her father. He passed away before I was born. My mom cried when she told me about it. Edit. I didn't expect so many people to be interested in the family history. Apparently, my grandfather, my mom's father, struggled with alcoholism. He lost a lot of motor function in his early 30s due to an accident, based on what I've been told. My mom's memory is patchy, and I couldn't reach her brothers to confirm more. After the accident, he spiraled badly. Life became very difficult for my mom, her 3 siblings, and their mother. It was a lot. He wrecked my mom's first car, got rid of a beloved pet, and caused emotional harm that sometimes crossed into abuse. Toward the end of his life, he tried to make amends. He sold his hotel in Corpus Christi, Texas, and left the money and estate to the kids. He attempted to reconnect to some degree and talk about what had happened. All of this is secondhand, of course. My mom's feelings on the matter are clearly complicated. I've never seen any family member on that side ever mention him. Story 20. I'm late to this post, but I fully believe that my son is my grandfather version 2. Here are just a couple of examples, though there are many more I could share. When my son was about 3, I took him to visit my grandmother a few states away for the first time. He had never been in her house before, but the moment we walked in, he toddled over to her, placed his little hand on her cheek, and said, "I have missed you so much, Annie." Then he climbed into her lap, patted her hand, and added, "I really liked your black hair more." Several years before that, my grandmother Anne had stopped coloring her hair, let it go white, and started wearing a wig. No one called her Annie except for my grandfather. Later on, he was walking down the hallway and noticed a photo of my grandfather in his military band uniform. My son stopped, pointed right at it, and said, "That was when I was playing in the band." At age 3, he had never been told much about my grandfather, just that he wasn't here anymore. We didn't have any photos of him as a young man at home. Story 21. I had something strange happen when I was 22, and I didn't remember it until almost 20 years later. Back in 1993, I was in the Navy attending hospital corpsman school, which is kind of like medical or nursing assistant training. One whole week was dedicated to pharmacy and medications. For some reason, I already knew all the medication names just by reading the textbook. It felt like reading something I had studied 10 or 20 times before. Everything came naturally. I just knew all of the meds already. My classmates were annoyed by how easily it came to me. I couldn't explain it. But whatever, I got an A. Flash forward 20 years. One night I had a dream that I was back in hospital corpsman school and studying medications. In the dream, I was talking to a classmate and said something like, "I don't need to learn the med names. It's already drilled into my head from being a nurse for so long." I remember this dream clearly because I actually woke up while saying that last part, and my husband heard me. So maybe I really was a nurse in a past life. Story 22. I was the kid in this story. When I was around 3 or 4, I used to have recurring dreams that felt incredibly real. In the dream, I lived in a white farmhouse with green shutters, a short driveway, an old-fashioned red truck, and a horse barn attached at the back. There was a single black horse. I had this dream so often that I nearly convinced myself I had lived there before. I repeatedly asked my parents about it. Even though my family had always lived in the same, very different house my entire life, the dream always ended the same way. A balding man would sneak into the house and push me out of an upstairs window. That's when I'd wake up. Eventually, I grew out of the dream and forgot about it for many years. Then in my late teens, I went on a road trip with my boyfriend to a neighboring state. While driving down a nearly empty, heavily forested back road, I saw the house from my dream. I demanded that we turn around, and he agreed. The house was exactly the same. Around back was the same barn, and parked next to it, the old red Ford truck, just like in the dream. Story 23. I spooked my parents when I was about 3. Okay, this is a little complicated. I'm adopted. When my soon-to-be adoptive parents were working with a social worker, my mom mentioned that they'd be happy with any child, but that she had always wanted a red-haired girl. The social worker was pretty excited to tell her that there were 2 red-haired baby girls available for adoption at that time. My parents came to see me at the foster home, and that was it. They never met the other red-haired baby. Fast forward a few years. I'm in a preschool class with another red-haired girl. My parents start talking to hers and find out that she was also adopted. She was the other baby the social worker had mentioned. Weird, but kind of cool, right? My parents were always open about my adoption, as much as you can explain to a 3-year-old anyway. But the other girl's parents hadn't told her. So my parents didn't say anything until the end of the school year, when the other girl's family was moving away. When my dad told me, hey, guess what? X was adopted too. I just responded, yeah, I know. When asked how I could possibly know that, I said, X and me knew each other in heaven. Apparently, I explained that before we were here, we were waiting with the other babies. I said we watched people and decided which families to go to. X and I decided to be adopted and to meet each other on Earth. It was probably just a child's imagination. But honestly, it's kind of a beautiful idea, I think. Story 24. My 3-year-old does it all, the time, and she has basically done it since she could talk. Like others have mentioned, she often talks about her old mama and sometimes refers to me as her new mama. It's never manipulative, like, but my old mama let me do that. It's just passing comments like, my old mama didn't sing that song, she sang different ones. Or after we discuss a safety rule, she'll say, I know, my old mama used to say that too. She also talks about when she was a mother. She had 4 children, but one of them was mean and people didn't like him as much. She says she lived in a town with lots of hills, didn't have a husband, baked lots and lots of bread for people, and always wore an apron. There are plenty of creepy things she'll say, but what I find most interesting is how she tells her dad and me that we died before. No details, just that we died before we became who we are now. Story 25. My 3-year-old at age 2 once told me that her mummy's mum was trying to say she loved me. That's my nan, her grandma. She still refuses to call my mom her nan, insisting instead that she's her mummy's mum. Then she started saying how things were easier when she was a boy. She also told us that her big sister has always been her mum, and I'm usually her baby, and that I was a good baby. Her brother has always been her brother, and she's incredibly protective of him. Some of the things she says are hard to hear, especially when she mentions her other daddy, who was a bad person and hurt them all. According to her, that's not the daddy she has now. She says her current dad is a good one, but not very old. It's all very strange, but she repeats it a lot and says it in a very matter-of-fact tone. One beautiful thing is that she's brought my poorly elderly mother so much joy. I honestly believe she's the reason my mom keeps going. They spend hours together, and neither can explain what they've talked about, but the happiness in their eyes says everything. Story 26. Not a parent, but the older sister. My older brother died when he was 7 and I was 2. It was tragic. He fell out of the back of a truck while it was just cruising around a neighborhood at normal speed and hit his head on the concrete. That's why I'm so strongly against anyone riding in the back of trucks. Freak accidents happen. Anyway, my younger brother just turned 7. Recently, he's been saying things like, I want to skip being 7, and being 7 makes me feel sick. At first, it just seemed like something random a kid might say, but lately he started saying things like, oh, just thinking about the accident, when we ask what's on his mind. I don't know how to feel. On one hand, yeah, kids say weird stuff. He does know about our older brother's death and how it happened. But on the other hand, a part of my brain can't help but think it's kind of eerie. They look almost identical in childhood photos, and according to my mom, they share a lot of personality traits too. Story 27. Here's a personal story from when I was a child. From age 2 to 4, I used to talk in my sleep to my great-grandma Levon, who died when my mother was just 3 years old in 1976. My mom thought it was strange, especially because she had never mentioned her grandma by name. What made it even odder was that her grandmother went by her middle name, Levon. Her real first name was Mary, yet I somehow knew both names. When I was 4, my mom was going through some old family photos she had received from relatives. I pulled one out, pointed to a woman in a group photo, and immediately started crying because I missed her. My mom said that later that week, when she picked me up from daycare, the staff gave her their condolences because I'd been crying all day for Gigi Levon. My mom believed that was the last time Gigi visited me. There's more. In 1977, my grandparents, along with my mom and uncle, moved into a new house. My mom was 4 at the time. A little red bird kept landing on their boxes and stayed very close to them. It even tried flying into the house. They always said it was their little friend. Fast forward to when I was 3. One day my grandpa was reminiscing about that move. I apparently said, "I had fun that day." My grandpa laughed and said that wasn't possible because my mom was only 4, and I wasn't even born yet. Then I apparently said, "I was there. Don't you remember me? I was the little red bird." No one had ever mentioned that bird to me, and they still bring it up now that I'm 27. I once had a medium tell me my Gigi is always with me, and she could see her. I took it with a grain of salt, until she also said I had been a bird in a past life. She told me that Gigi and I died at the same time and entered the spirit world together. My family moved into that house in 1977, the same year Gigi passed away. And one more thing, I also have vivid memories of being a nurse during World War II. I used to tell my mom all sorts of details and she'd laugh, saying I reminded her of Clara Barton with my stories. Maybe just coincidence. Maybe not. Story 28. My 2-year-old is still too young, but I remember the last moments of my past life, or at least what I believe is my very first memory. Let me explain. This has always been my earliest memory in life, and I still remember it clearly. I was in an old car, probably from the 1970s or 80s. The seats were red burgundy. I was sitting in the back, on the passenger side. I remember there were 2 other men in the car with me. The vehicle was moving slowly, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of rocks beneath the tires. I looked to my right, out the window, and saw an arm, most likely one of the men pushing the car forward. I felt restrained, or at least unable to move, except that I could turn my head slightly from side to side. Eventually, we reached the edge of a hill or cliff, and the car was pushed over. I remember the front of the car hitting the bottom and the vehicle being stuck vertically. I managed to say to the man in front of me, who I think I saw regaining consciousness, "What do we do now?" He said something back, but I can't remember what. Then things started going dark, like I was losing consciousness. The very next memory I have is of being in a crib, looking up at my mom, uncle, grandmother, and grandfather. Maybe it's not exactly what this thread is about, but I thought it was worth sharing. Story 29. My son and the blue shovel. This happened last fall at a state park when my son was 3. We had gone to the park to walk the trails and play at the playground. The park has a beach, but we almost never go that way. For some reason, though, he was fixated on going to the beach, even though it was late September or early October and far too cold to play in the water. The entire walk there, he kept insisting that he was going to dig a hole with a blue shovel. He was very specific about the color. We told him we didn't bring any toys, and he doesn't even own a blue shovel. We got to the beach and he took off running, about 100 feet straight to a lone picnic table. And there it was, a blue plastic shovel sitting right there on the table, waiting for him. I still have no explanation for how he knew it would be there, or how he knew exactly where to go. There was no way he could have seen it from that distance, and this beach doesn't have toys lying around for public use. It's not like he had ever played there with a blue shovel before. That's not the first or last time he's come out with something eerie, but this one still has no logical explanation. Story 30. A little late to the post, and I'm not a parent, but my boyfriend once really freaked out his dad when he was around 2 or 3 years old. He's never liked being around horses, despite growing up around them. His dad is a blacksmith, and I think this might be the reason why. One day while in the car, he suddenly woke up from a nap, crying. His dad asked him what was wrong, and he said he had just remembered how he died. He said he was a cowboy, described what he was wearing, and explained that the horse he was riding got startled by a snake and bucked him off. He broke his collarbone and couldn't get it fixed properly, and it became septic. That's how he died. Needless to say, his dad was pretty freaked out, especially since his 2 or 3-year-old was using terms he definitely hadn't been exposed to yet. After telling the story, my boyfriend apparently went right back to sleep. Story 31. This is actually a past life memory I've had, or at least that's what it felt like. When I was 18 and just starting to date my husband, we planned a double date with his sister and her girlfriend. It was my first time meeting them, and we had agreed to meet up at our favorite bar. From the moment his sister's girlfriend and I were introduced, we both got super excited to see each other. We hugged really tightly, and I had this overwhelming feeling like I hadn't seen her in years. I honestly felt such relief, like reuniting with someone I'd missed for a long time. My husband was confused and thought we already knew each other, but we clearly had never met before. It was so strange, but I just knew I had known her in another life. It was such a powerful feeling, unexplainable, but very real. Now we're super close. Great friends and family. We don't talk about that moment much anymore, but every now and then, we still joke about how we finally found each other again. Story 32. I was sitting at a stoplight and traffic was turning across the intersection in front of me. You know how, when people turn in front of you, you instinctively watch to see how close they get, and sometimes for just a second, you kind of make eye contact as the details of their face blur past? As this one car turned in front of me, I made immediate, direct eye contact with a girl sitting in the back seat. I know it sounds cliche, but time seemed to slow down and stretch, like it was taking forever for the car to finish its turn, even though it was moving at a normal speed. We held each other's gaze for the entire turn. Her eyes lit up with a mischievous spark, and she gave me this knowing smile, a smirk that I couldn't help but return with a strange sense of joyful recognition. Just as I started to wonder about our reactions, the angle of the turn and my position broke our eye contact. In that instant, time seemed to snap back into place, like a rubber band recoiling. The car was suddenly halfway down the road and out of sight in my mirror, moving faster than it seemed during the turn. It reminded me of the magic bus scene in the third Harry Potter movie. The look on her face felt like it was saying, "Hey, I know you. See you next time." And now, 6 to 8 years later, I can still almost picture her face, especially that grin. I sometimes wonder who she was, how we knew each other, and if I'll ever see her again. Such a strange feeling, not just in that moment, but even now, all these years later. I think about that one passing stranger whose total interaction with me lasted all of 1.5 seconds. Northern Colorado, on the off chance this sounds familiar to anyone. Story 33. I used to get a lot of nightmares when I was little. Whenever I woke up scared and crying, my dad would always come and comfort me. I'd tell him about the dream while he sat with me and helped me calm down. One night, I had a nightmare that my family and I were at the beach with my mom's brother and his wife. In the dream, my dad disappeared, and a violent thunderstorm hit. We all ran to hide under a pavilion while the storm raged. There were lightning strikes everywhere and fires were breaking out. I even saw people getting struck by lightning. I remember being terrified that my dad had been hit and wasn't coming back. But here's the thing, it wasn't just a dream, it was a real memory. We really had gone to the beach with my mom's brother and his wife, and there really was a sudden, violent thunderstorm. My dad had gone to the car, and because it was parked far away, he stayed there and waited out the storm. A nearby shop was struck by lightning and caught fire, and fire trucks came to the scene. No one was actually struck by lightning. That part was my imagination, but the rest really happened. The most incredible part? My mom was pregnant with me at the time. I hadn't even been born yet, and yet somehow I had a dream that replayed a traumatic moment from my family's past, something I shouldn't have been able to remember at all. I didn't really recall the dream the next morning, but my dad remembered it and later found the old video my mom had taken that day, buried deep in storage. Story 34. I'm not a parent, but I used to work at a daycare. We had one boy about 3 years old, almost 4, who would get into trouble quite a bit during the day. He was a good kid, just had a lot of energy, and sometimes that would lead to him being separated from the other kids because he'd get a little too physical. One afternoon, he was sent to the office with me while I was making copies. He sat at a little table drawing and talking to me. When I finished the copies, I sat down next to him and asked what he had drawn. It looked like a blue crib or cage with a person lying down in it and a big cloud hovering above. He said, and I will never forget this, "That's me in my old bed before I died." I was like, "Oh, and how did you think of this picture?" But he just shrugged and kept coloring. His quiet time ended, and I took him back outside to the playground. He acted totally normal the rest of the day, and honestly, the rest of the time I knew him. But wow, that was definitely not the answer I was expecting. Story 35. When I was 6 months pregnant, my great-grandfather was in the final stages of cancer. During his last days, my grandmother told him that I had finally picked a name for my son. He was very hard of hearing, and when he asked what name I chose, he thought she said John, which was actually his own name. He teared up and was very touched, so she didn't correct him. He passed away shortly after. 3 days later, I went into premature labor. My son ended up staying in the NICU for nearly 4 months. As he got older, he began talking about Papa John a lot and became incredibly fascinated with his old belongings at my grandmother's house. He talked about Papa John constantly, as if he had truly known him. He'd say things like how he missed him and missed his hugs. When we asked what he remembered, he said that Papa John stayed with him in the hospital. One time, while visiting my grandmother for the weekend, a striking yellow butterfly kept fluttering around the porch every time we stepped outside. My son looked at it and said it was Papa John coming to visit. He'd just casually say, "Hey, Papa," like it was the most natural thing in the world. This went on almost constantly between ages 2 and 4. I should also mention that I was never close to my great-grandfather and rarely ever spoke about him. I didn't lead my son on. I just listened. Over time, he stopped mentioning him and seems to have forgotten about it completely. Story 36. Not sure if this fits, but I've had snippets of what I believe to be a past life that surface from time to time. Ever since I was a little boy, I've remembered being a young girl in the before times. The memories are vivid, detailed, and strangely consistent. 3 specific memories have stuck with me for as long as I can remember. The first is of standing in front of a hallway mirror in a child's nightdress, holding a stuffed animal and looking at myself. The lighting was dim. I believe I was in my grandmother's apartment. I had dark eyes, wavy, messy hair, like the kind little girls wake up with. I think I was around 4 to 6 years old. In another memory, I'm sitting in front of a console TV in the same apartment, watching ballerinas in black and white. The living room had a mix of early 1960s chic and old-world European decor. There was a clock over the mantel and white shag carpet on the floor. I remember feeling like Mom and Papa were away a lot. There was something about them being followed, something involving politics or a resistance movement, so I spent a lot of time with Grandma. The third memory is the most intense. I'm wearing a green pea coat, a straw hat with a ribbon, and white gloves. I'm 6, holding my mother's hand at a train station in a mountainous area, surrounded by snow-capped peaks. The station is outdoors with brickwork and a large station clock. It's busy and crowded. I believe it was somewhere in the European Alps, France, Switzerland, or Italy, around the mid-1960s. As the train approached, a big silver modern train, I suddenly felt a push from behind. I was shoved right in front of it. I don't remember the impact or pain, but I knew it hit me. My final thoughts in English were, "He pushed me." I screamed it in my head like an apology. That memory comes back a lot, especially in dreams. I was born in 1968 in the Mediterranean. I believe this past life happened just before then. I don't speak French, and neither did my parents, but I've always felt deeply drawn to the language, like I knew it long ago. Story 37. Apparently, when I was around 3 or 4 years old, I used to stare out my bedroom window at night toward my grandparents' house. My mom once asked me why I was staring, and I replied, "I just remember that was my room." When she asked me to explain, I said, "Why did they knock down that dang wall?" What's strange is that my great-grandfather used to live in the room I was pointing at. After he passed away, a year before I was born, my grandfather tore a wall down in that room and turned it into a sunroom. My mom didn't know about this, and neither did my dad. When she mentioned it casually to my grandparents, my grandfather was in total disbelief. Then when I was 5, I stayed with them over the summer. One day while picking strawberries with my grandmother, I said, "Isn't this where we had the pigs? Where'd the shed go?" They had stopped keeping pigs when my great-grandfather got too old to care for them, and the shed had been torn down after a tree limb hit it during a tornado. There was no way I could have known that. My mom also said I would sometimes say things in another language, Hungarian, which was my great-grandfather's native language. My great-aunt told my dad it sounded like a curse their father used to say often. She later told me the strange behavior stopped after we moved and only returned when I visited. I stopped visiting after I was 7 due to a falling out between my dad and my grandfather. She once speculated that maybe my great-grandfather had possessed me. It was always unsettling how she talked about it. Story 38. My mother told me this story, and it has haunted me ever since. Let me start by saying I grew up in New Zealand, but my mom grew up in Australia. When she was younger, she had a friend named Chris who sadly died in a car crash near a place called Narration. Years later, after she moved to New Zealand, I was about 5 years old and sitting in the lounge room. Apparently, I started asking her, "Where's the car?" She was confused, so she took me to the front of the house and pointed to our green Tarago van. I then said, No, the blue car, with the big peanut in the window." At first, she figured it must have been something I saw in a cartoon or TV show. But a few days later, I brought it up again, this time saying, "The guy with the big glasses took the car." My mom froze. Years later, she told me the truth. Her friend Chris had driven a blue Subaru Impreza. He was known for wearing ridiculously large sunglasses. And most eerie of all, he had a peanut butter scented air freshener shaped like a peanut hanging in his car. Story 39. My daughter was trying to walk as early as 6 months old. She would push herself up but couldn't quite manage to walk properly yet. When she struggled, she would screech in frustration, looking genuinely angry, like she was upset that her body couldn't do what it was supposed to. She'd get this intense, almost furious look and cry out in frustration. I thought it was just normal baby behavior. We used to hang out with a pagan group that met at a local shop. It had people from all walks of life, pagans, Wiccans, Christians, even Satanists. One day, an older woman visiting from out of town saw our daughter and said, "Oh, another old soul like myself. How you doing, you old lass?" We laughed, thinking it was a joke, until she turned to us and said seriously, "I mean that literally. She's frustrated because she remembers what she's capable of. She was a stubborn old coot in her past life. You're going to have your hands full." As our daughter grew, she started talking about past lives, mentioning her kids, how she used to live, and even how she died. She once said she remembered swinging from a tree and going to sleep. Strangely, she has a birthmark right where the skull meets the spine. She's incredibly mature for her age. She talks with clarity, uses advanced vocabulary, and knows weirdly accurate facts about plants and trees that no one ever taught her. Around other kids her age, the difference is noticeable. She's still very much a child, but it's the little things that make us feel like she's something more. Story 40. Not about my child, but something that happened to me when I turned 5. On the night of my 5th birthday, I had a dream that felt incredibly real. In it, I was a little girl celebrating her 9th birthday. Everyone, including me, spoke Spanish. I called my parents Mama and Papa, which I've never done in real life. In the dream, they threw me a small birthday party. My mom gave me a movie on VHS that I had wanted badly. Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation. I remember the plot perfectly, even to this day. After watching it with my guests, we went out to the backyard and played games on the grass. Then a boy around my age who bullied me at school showed up with a plastic cup filled with blue liquid. He told me it was blue lemonade. I smelled it. It didn't seem right. But he kept pressuring me to drink it. I took 2 big gulps. Suddenly, I was vomiting blood all over my white dress. Kids started screaming and running. I remember the blood and vomit running down my chin before blacking out. I woke up in an ambulance. My parents were outside while paramedics hooked me up to machines. Something was pumping my stomach, and there was a tube down my throat. A nurse kept slapping my cheek gently, trying to keep me awake. But I couldn't stay awake. I started floating above my body. I heard my mom scream hysterically. My dad turned away. I floated up into the clouds, and then I woke up. I'm 23 now, and I still remember it clearly. The weirdest part is how accurate it was. I knew that Tiny Toons movie in detail, even though it came out in 1992, 5 years before I was born. I've also accidentally called my parents Mama and Papa, even though I've never used those words. I sometimes wonder if I relived the final moments of a past life, and I hope, wherever she is, that my old mama found peace. Story 41. Not a parent, but I used to have very vivid dreams of being a soldier in the British Army during the 1960s, specifically a paratrooper. One scene that stands out clearly is marching along a damp trail. I was wearing the paratrooper camouflage smock, carrying an L1A1 rifle. I remember staring at the rucksack of the man in front of me. He wore a maroon beret, and I knew he was a lieutenant. I was second in line, with 6 more soldiers behind me. I even remember having facial hair. I had other dreams too, some recurring. Most of them faded by the time I was 20. I recall moments of combat, waking up in a panic afterward, but I don't remember who we were fighting or where it was. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the Falklands. But those images and that one vivid dream never fully left me. Story 42. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, we visited a random house in central Texas that was over 100 years old. It was a farmhouse not far from I-35. As we walked in with the realtor, I told my mom she might not like the inside of the kitchen cabinets because they were still bright yellow. She opened them up and sure enough, they were a horrid bright yellow inside. Even the realtor looked flustered. Then we went upstairs. The realtor was talking about the finished attic and the 3 bedrooms up there, when I pointed at a blank wooden wall and asked, "What about that room?" The realtor looked confused and said she had no idea what I meant. I walked over to the corner, started feeling around and found a latch. I opened it and revealed a hidden door that led into a completely normal room, just one without any windows. The realtor was stunned. No one had any idea that room even existed. When she asked me how I knew it was there, I simply said, "Well, this used to be my house, and that room is where I did all my sewing, so I didn't disturb the rest of the house." As I got older, I forgot most of the details about the interior of that house, but I'll never forget that room or the looks on the faces of the realtor and my parents when it all happened. Story 43. My dad told me that when he came home from work one day, my little brother, who was about 3 years old at the time, was sitting behind the couch having a full conversation with someone. My dad asked who he was talking to, and my brother replied, "Your best friend Reggie." That creeped my dad out because Reggie had passed away shortly before my brother was born. While my mom was still pregnant, Reggie had been around a lot, helping my mom out since my dad traveled often for work. After Reggie passed, we didn't talk about him much, especially not around my brother, so the fact that he knew that name was unsettling. Then a year or so later, my brother, now around 4, was out in the street punting a football back and forth. My dad asked where he got the football from, and he replied, "Your friend Reggie gave it to me." That freaked my dad out for a couple of reasons. First, we only had 2 footballs at home, both regulation size, but my brother was kicking a kid-size one with Reggie's college logo on it. Second, Reggie had been an NFL punter, and no one in the house was teaching my 4-year-old brother how to punt. My dad still gets chills when we bring it up. Story 44. I've told this before, but it still gives me chills. It was early afternoon on Halloween. This time of year is hard for me because my first child was stillborn near this date. I was sitting in a chair in the den, and my husband was at the desk across the room. Our 2.5-year-old daughter was walking around, not really doing anything in particular. As always happens on this day, my thoughts drifted to my stillborn daughter. Suddenly, my little girl plopped a book into my lap. She was only 2 years old and couldn't read yet. Our walls were filled with books, but this one stood out. It was a pagan book for grieving parents, one that had been given to me after the loss. I was startled by the coincidence and just stared at it. Then my daughter flipped it open and pointed to a paragraph. I read it. It was about how a child who dies might reincarnate into the same family or somewhere nearby. As I sat there stunned, wondering where my lost child could have gone, my daughter patted my leg and said, "I'm right here, Mommy." Translating toddler speak, "I'm right here, Mommy." We hadn't spoken a word out loud before that. Just thinking about it still gives me chills. Story 45. This one is about me. The morning of September 19th, 1980. I was 8 years old. I got dropped off at Mrs. P's house. She was the one driving our carpool to school. We alternated who drove. I don't remember the schedule exactly, but that day I got in her car and felt really uneasy. I asked Mrs. P, "I'd feel a lot more comfortable if I could wear a seatbelt back here. Could you get a garden trowel and dig them out of the crack?" This was back when cars had big bench seats, and seatbelts would fall into the cracks between the cushions. I didn't even know what a trowel was or why I said that, but my sisters remember me saying it clearly. Later that day, we got back into Mrs. P's car to go home. Her son C was in the front seat. My little sister sat to my left, my oldest sister to my right, and I was in the middle sitting on the hump. I was exhausted and fell asleep. Then everything went black. I woke up as a helicopter was lifting off. My little sister was in it. Mrs. P had turned left in front of a telephone truck on the highway, and we got hit. She was pregnant and gave birth that day. Her son C had to use a wheelchair for a long time and relearn how to walk and talk. My older sister had her head split open badly. She slammed it into the back of C's seat. When I woke up, I was covered in glass, but only had a single scratch on my arm. I pushed C's seat forward and got out of the car. The dashboard was nearly touching me. It was completely crushed. I saw my sister lying on a blanket, surrounded by paramedics. I started panicking. The paramedics and police looked at me in shock and asked, "Where did you come from?" I said, "At the car," and pointed at it. They were stunned. Apparently, they had already checked the car and triaged the scene. They had pulled my sisters out and left me because they thought I was dead. No one came back for me. For what must have been 45 minutes, they thought I was gone. To this day, I wonder if maybe I was. Since then, I've always trusted my instincts. I call it my gut detector. It didn't save me that day, but it tried. I've listened to it ever since.